The judge is staring at me like I've lost my mind. My sister Jennifer is gripping her husband's arm so tight her knuckles have gone white. My brother Michael keeps shifting in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the courthouse air conditioning running full blast. I'm standing in front of Hamilton County's most intimidating judge, holding a small digital recorder in my trembling hand. The courtroom is dead silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and my father's labored breathing from his wheelchair in the front row. Your Honor, I say, my voice somehow steadier than I feel. Before you declare my father incompetent and strip him of everything he's worked for his entire life, I think you need to hear what my siblings really said when they thought no one was listening. Jennifer's face goes pale. Michael starts to stand up, but his wife yanks him back down. The lawyer they hired, my own brother-in-law, looks like he's about to throw up. Because they all know exactly what's on this recording. And they know it's about to destroy everything they've spent 6 months planning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 hours ago I was sitting in this same courtroom, listening to my own family lie to a judge about my father's mental capacity. 3 hours ago I watched my sister Jennifer tell the court that our dad couldn't remember her name, couldn't manage his medications, and needed to be placed in full-time memory care for his own safety. 3 hours ago, I sat there while my brother Michael testified that Dad had burned dinner so many times, the smoke alarm was like a dinner bell, that he'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store he'd shopped at for 30 years, and that he'd called him at 2 in the morning, asking where Mom was, even though she'd been dead for 3 years. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves. The worst part was watching Dad's face as his own children painted him as a confused, helpless old man who needed to be locked away. His shoulders sagged lower with every word. His hands, those same hands that had built our childhood treehouse and taught me to change a tire, trembled in his lap. I'm 32 years old. I work as a medical office manager at Springfield General Hospital, which means I know exactly what real dementia looks like. I've seen patients who truly can't care for themselves, whose families are making genuinely heartbreaking decisions about their safety. My father isn't one of them. Yes, Dad has early-stage dementia. Elena Rodriguez diagnosed him 18 months ago, and we've been managing it together ever since. He takes his medications in a pill organizer I refill every Sunday. He writes himself notes and keeps a detailed calendar. He still drives during the day to familiar places. He lives independently in the house on Maple Street where he raised 3 kids and cared for our mother through her final battle with cancer. But Jennifer and Michael weren't in that courtroom because they were worried about Dad's safety. They were there because our family home is worth $400,000, and Dad has another $200,000 in retirement savings that they want to get their hands on. The memory care facility they're pushing costs $8,000 a month. Simple math tells you what happens to that inheritance if Dad lives there for 5 or 10 years. I've been Dad's primary caregiver since Mom died. I have power of attorney because he chose to give it to me, not because I manipulated him or because he wasn't capable of making the decision. Every Sunday I meal prep for the week and stock his freezer. Every Wednesday, Grace Murphy, a home health aide, comes to help with cleaning and make sure he's taking his medications properly. Rodriguez sees him monthly and has consistently reported that he's stable and managing well with support. But as I listened to Jennifer's lawyer husband Patrick weave a narrative about Dad being a danger to himself and others, I realized that none of these facts mattered. They had come prepared with their own medical expert, Dr. Harrison Webb, a neurologist who had spent exactly 45 minutes with Dad and somehow concluded he needed immediate placement in memory care. They had a social worker, Amanda Foster, who had visited once and written a report full of concerns about his living situation. The judge, Catherine Morrison, was taking notes as Patrick laid out their case. Dad needed to be declared incompetent. His assets needed to be managed by a court-appointed guardian. For his own protection, of course, for his own good. That's when I stood up. Your Honor, I have evidence that will completely change your understanding of this case. Patrick jumped to his feet. Objection. Mitchell can't just introduce evidence that wasn't part of discovery. Judge Morrison held up her hand. What kind of evidence, Miss Mitchell? My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and preparing for simultaneous. A recording. Your Honor? A recording of the petitioners discussing their real motivations for this proceeding. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer was whispering furiously to Patrick. Michael looked like he was going to be sick. Dad, bless him, just looked confused by all the commotion. I'll allow it, Judge Morrison said, and the bottom fell out of my siblings' world. Because what they didn't know was that for the past 2 months, ever since Patrick filed this petition, I had been carrying a small digital recorder everywhere I went. I had been documenting every conversation, every family meeting, every interaction where they discussed Dad's future. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I work in healthcare and I understand the importance of documentation when someone's rights are at stake. And 3 weeks ago, I had recorded a conversation that proved everything they had just told the court was a calculated lie. I had been at Dad's house helping him organize his medications for the week when Jennifer and Michael showed up unannounced. They didn't know I was there because my car was in the garage getting an oil change, and Dad had picked me up. They walked right into the kitchen where I was sitting with Dad at his old Formica table. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of family dinners growing up. What followed was 23 minutes of the most damning conversation I'd ever heard in my life, and every single word of it was captured in crystal clear digital audio. Standing in that courtroom, holding that recorder, I looked at my siblings one more time. Jennifer had that pinched expression she'd worn since high school whenever she got caught doing something she shouldn't. Michael was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eye. Patrick was frantically shuffling through papers like he could find some legal loophole to stop what was about to happen. Play the recording, Judge Morrison instructed. I pressed play, and my father's voice filled the courtroom. Sarah, honey, could you grab me a glass of water? All this talk about money is making my mouth dry. Then Jennifer's voice, sharp and impatient. Dad, we're trying to have a serious conversation here. I'm listening, Dad replied, his voice clear and completely coherent. You're talking about selling my house and putting me somewhere I don't want to go. Trust me, I'm paying attention. Michael's voice came next. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. The doctors say you need more care than Sarah can provide. Which doctors? Dad asked. Because Dr. Rodriguez thinks I'm doing fine. She told me just last week that I was managing better than most of her patients. There was a pause on the recording. Then Jennifer's voice, frustrated. That's not the point. Dad, the point is we need to be practical about this situation. Practical about what situation? Dad's voice was getting stronger, more assertive. The situation where my children want to sell my home and split the money while I'm still alive to watch them do it. The courtroom was completely silent now. Every word was landing like a physical blow. But the real devastation was still coming. Michael's voice on the recording. Nobody's talking about splitting money. Dad, then Jennifer, and this was the moment that would end their case completely. Michael. He's not going to remember this conversation anyway. Why are we pretending? We've already talked to the facility. They'll take him next month if we can get the competency ruling. The house will sell fast in this market. Even after Patrick's fees and the facility cost for the first year, we're looking at splitting at least $300,000. Jennifer, Michael hissed on the recording. What? Sarah's not here and he won't remember. Look at him. He's already confused about what we're talking about. But Dad's voice came through loud and clear. I'm sitting right here, Jennifer. I can hear every word you're saying. And I'm not confused about anything. You want me declared incompetent so you can take my house and my money. You're willing to lie to a judge and lock me away to do it. The silence that followed on the recording stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Then Dad's voice again, quieter now but devastating in its clarity. Your mother would be ashamed of what you're doing. She made me promise to fight for my independence as long as I could. She said the day I stopped fighting would be the day I really lost myself. Jennifer's response was barely audible but unmistakable. Well, Mom's not here anymore, is she? I stopped the recording. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. Judge Morrison was staring at Jennifer and Michael like she'd never seen anything quite like them before. Patrick was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this disaster. Is there more? Judge Morrison asked. 18 more minutes, I replied, including the part where they discuss coaching Webb on what to include in his evaluation, and how to make Dad's symptoms sound worse than they really are. Jennifer finally found her voice. That recording was made without our consent. It's illegal. Margaret Chen, the elder law attorney I had hired to represent Dad and me, stood up with a slight smile. Ohio is a one-party consent state, Your Honor. Miss Mitchell was present during the conversation and had every right to record it, particularly when she reasonably believed it was necessary to protect her father's interests. Patrick was frantically whispering to Jennifer, but she shook him off. This is ridiculous. Dad needs care. Sarah can't provide the level of supervision he requires. I looked at Dad sitting in his wheelchair not because he couldn't walk, but because the stress of the hearing had exhausted him. His eyes were clear and focused, watching the proceedings with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Your Honor, I said, my father doesn't need a wheelchair. He doesn't need to be in memory care. He needs to be protected from his own children, who are willing to lie to a court and destroy his dignity to get access to his money. Judge Morrison looked at the court report. Strike everything the petitioners have presented as testimony. Schedule a new evaluation with an independent neurologist and social worker, both to be selected by the court. This proceeding is continued for 30 days. She turned to Jennifer and Michael with the kind of look that made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. And I'm ordering an investigation into potential elder abuse and fraud. If I find out you've been pressuring or manipulating Miss Mitchell in any way, you'll be facing criminal charges. Patrick was already packing up his briefcase. The case was over, and he knew it. Jennifer was staring at me with pure hatred. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. But Dad, my sweet, supposedly incompetent father, reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you, sweetheart, he whispered. I knew you'd fight for me. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money or houses or inheritance. This was about the fundamental question of whether someone's worth is measured by their bank account or their humanity, whether family means protecting each other or consuming each other. And as I helped Dad out of that courthouse and into my car for the drive back to the house on Maple Street, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That would remain his home. I understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let people destroy someone you care about, even when those people share your last name. The recording had saved Dad's independence and his dignity, but it had cost me my siblings forever. As we drove through the familiar streets of Springfield, past the diner where Dad still met his friends for coffee every Thursday, past the park where he'd pushed us on swings 30 years ago, I realized I was completely at peace with that trait. The morning after the courthouse victory, I woke up in Dad's guest bedroom to the sound of him making coffee in the kitchen. Real coffee, not the instant stuff Jennifer had tried to convince the judge he was too confused to operate safely. I could hear him humming an old Johnny Cash song, the same tune he'd whistled while building the deck behind this house 20 years ago. I had stayed the night because honestly I didn't trust Jennifer and Michael not to show up and try something desperate. They had invested too much time and money into this scheme to walk away quietly. Patrick's legal fees alone probably cost them $15,000, and Jennifer had already put a deposit down on a condo in Scottsdale that she'd planned to buy with her share of Dad's estate. When I walked into the kitchen, Dad was standing at the counter reading the Springfield Herald, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose exactly the way they'd been every morning for as long as I could remember. He looked up and smiled, that same crooked grin that had reassured me through skinned knees and broken hearts. and every crisis of my 32 years. Morning, honey. Coffee's fresh. This was the man Jennifer and Michael had tried to convince a judge couldn't remember their name. The man they'd claimed wandered the house at night, calling for Mom, confused about where he was, standing there in his worn plaid bathrobe, completely oriented and present. He looked nothing like the helpless patient they'd described in their petition. Dad, I said, pouring myself a cup from the pot he'd made perfectly, we need to talk about what happens next. He folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention. This was another thing Jennifer and Michael had gotten wrong about Dad's condition. Yes, he had moments of confusion, especially when he was tired or stressed. Yes, he sometimes repeated stories or forgot small details, but when something was important, when it really mattered, his mind was sharp as ever. I know what you're thinking, he said. You're wondering if they'll try again. Different lawyers, different doctors, different angle. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd done homework while he helped me with algebra problems. Dad was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd been avoiding. Jennifer called here at 6 this morning, before you were awake. My stomach dropped. What did she say? She said the recording was taken out of context, that she was just upset and said things she didn't mean. She wants to come over this afternoon to clear the air and talk about a compromise. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger that had been driving my decisions for months now. Jennifer wasn't. She was regrouping, probably with Patrick's help, trying to find another way to get what she wanted. The courthouse humiliation had been a setback, not a defeat. Dad, please tell me you told her no. He looked at me with those steady brown eyes that had seen me through every important moment of my life. I told her that any conversation about my future goes through you now, that I was making you my official advocate for all medical and legal decisions, and that if she wanted to discuss anything, she could call your lawyer. That's when I realized Dad wasn't just the victim in this situation. He was actively choosing to protect himself, making strategic decisions about how to handle his own children's betrayal. The narrative Jennifer and Michael had tried to sell, about a confused old man who needed others to think for him, wasn't just wrong, it was the opposite of who he actually was. I also called Dr. Rodriguez this morning. He continued, asked her to document my current cognitive state and send a copy to that judge. Figured we should have official medical records showing I'm competent to make these decisions. I stared at him, coffee cup halfway to my lips. You did all that before I even woke up. Sarah, I may have dementia, but I'm not stupid. Yesterday in that courtroom, I heard my own children plan to steal everything your mother and I worked for. I heard them talk about locking me away like an inconvenient problem they needed to solve. You think I'm going to just sit here and wait for them to try it again? The steel in his voice reminded me so much of Mom during her final months, when she'd fought every battle with her characteristic fierce determination. She had refused to be treated like a victim of her cancer, insisting on making her own decisions about treatment right up until the end. Dad had learned from watching her that dignity wasn't something you could preserve by being passive. What do you want to do? I asked. Dad leaned back in his chair, and I could see him organizing his thoughts the way he used to when he was managing production schedules at the GM plant. First, I want to change my will, make sure everything goes directly to you, with specific language, that Jennifer and Michael are excluded for attempting to manipulate the legal system. Second, I want to set up a trust that protects the house and my savings from any future attempts at guardianship. Third, I want to document everything that's happened, so if they try this again there's a clear pattern of financial abuse. I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For months I'd been carrying the entire burden of protecting Dad, while trying to preserve family relationships that were probably already destroyed. I'd been hoping that if I just managed everything carefully enough, if I just provided enough evidence of Dad's competence, I could somehow prevent this conflict from tearing our family apart completely. But sitting there listening to Dad lay out his own protection strategy, I realized I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd been trying to save a family that no longer existed. The people who would try to strip their father of his dignity and independence for money weren't family in any meaningful sense. They were adversaries who happened to share our DNA. There's something else, Dad said quietly. Something I probably should have told you months ago when this all started. I set down my coffee cup and waited. Your mother knew this was coming, not the specifics, but she knew Jennifer and Michael would come after the inheritance. The last month before she died, she kept talking about how they'd changed, how they only called when they needed something. She made me promise to fight them if they tried to take advantage after she was gone. Dad's voice cracked slightly, and I saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. She said you were the only one who took care of people without expecting something in return. Said you were the only one who really understood what family meant. The weight of that revelation settled over me like a blanket. Mom had seen this coming. She had prepared Dad for the possibility that his other children would become his adversaries. All these months I'd been questioning whether I was overreacting, whether I was being unfair to Jennifer and Michael by assuming the worst about their motive. But Mom had reached the same conclusion before her death. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I hoped she was wrong. I hoped that losing her would bring us all closer together, not drive us apart. I kept thinking maybe if I gave them time, if I tried to include them in decisions, they'd remember that love isn't something you can inherit. Dad stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the backyard where he'd taught all three of us to ride by. But yesterday in that courtroom, listening to them lie about me to a judge, I realized your mother was right. They stopped being my children the day they decided I was worth more to them helpless than healthy. That's when I made the decision that would define everything that came after. I wasn't going to spend any more energy trying to repair relationships with people who viewed Dad as a financial opportunity rather than a human being. I wasn't going to exhaust myself trying to preserve the illusion of family unity when Jennifer and Michael had already declared war. I was going to help Dad protect himself with the same fierce determination Mom had shown fighting her cancer, and if that meant accepting that our family was permanently broken, then so be it. Okay, I said, let's call Margaret Chen and set up everything you want to do. Legal protection, medical documentation, financial safeguards, all of it. Dad turned back from the window and smiled, but it was a different smile than I'd seen before, sadder but also more determined. It's going to get ugly, you know. They're not going to just accept this and walk away. I know. They're going to try to turn other people against us. Cousins, family, friends, maybe even people at your work. They're going to tell everyone their version of this story, where they're the concerned children and we're the ones being unreasonable. I know. And they're going to keep trying different approaches. Maybe they'll claim you're manipulating me, or that you're after the money yourself. They'll look for any angle that gets them what they want. I stood up and walked over to where Dad was standing by the window. Outside, the oak tree he'd planted when I was 10 was turning brilliant orange in the October sunlight. This house held 30 years of memories, birthday parties and holiday dinners and quiet Sunday mornings, just like this one. Jennifer and Michael wanted to sell all of that to finance their own lives. They wanted to erase our family history for cash. Dad, I've spent the last 3 years watching you take care of Mom with more grace and strength than I knew was possible. I've seen you manage your own diagnosis with courage and dignity. I've watched you maintain your independence while dealing with a condition that scares most people into complete dependence. I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling how solid and real he still was despite everything. Jennifer and Michael had tried to convince the world, if they want to keep fighting, we'll keep fighting back. But we're going to do it on our terms, protecting what matters instead of destroying it. Dad nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud of you. She'd be proud of both of us. That afternoon, Margaret Chen came to the house with a briefcase full of legal documents and a plan that would make it nearly impossible for Jennifer and Michael to challenge Dad's competency again. We spent 3 hours at the kitchen table, the same table where our family had made countless decisions over the years, creating a legal fortress around Dad's independence. The irrevocable trust would protect the house from any future claim. The updated will included specific language about the attempted guardianship and why Jennifer and Michael were being excluded. The medical power of attorney was revised, to ensure that only I could make healthcare decisions if Dad ever became truly incapacitated. Most importantly, we created a detailed record of everything that had happened, including transcripts of the courthouse recording and Margaret's professional assessment of the attempted financial abuse. If Jennifer and Michael tried this again, there would be a documented pattern of predatory behavior that no judge could ignore. As Margaret packed up her documents, she looked at both of us with the kind of respect I'd rarely seen lawyers show their clients. "I've been practicing elder law for 15 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves over money, but I've never seen anyone fight back as effectively as you two did yesterday." She turned specifically to Dad. "Mr. Mitchell, your cognitive evaluation from Rodriguez shows you're more than capable of making these decisions. Your performance in court yesterday proved you understand exactly what's at stake. Legally speaking, you're in a much stronger position now than you were a week ago." After Margaret left, Dad and I sat on the front porch watching the neighborhood kids walk home from school. This was another thing Jennifer and Michael had tried to take away from him, these simple daily pleasures that made life worth living. The familiarity of his own street, the routine of watching the world go by from the porch swing he'd built with his own hands. "Do you think they'll really try again?" I asked. Dad was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly in the old swing. "I think they're going to keep trying until they accept that the money's gone, not because we've spent it, but because they've lost any right to it. And you're okay with that, with Jennifer and Michael being out of our lives permanently?" Dad stopped rocking and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between sadness and relief. "Sarah, the children I raised would never have done what they did yesterday. Those kids wouldn't have lied to a judge about their father's mental capacity for money. They wouldn't have planned to lock me away in a facility I didn't want to go to." He started rocking again, his voice getting stronger. "I don't know what happened to Jennifer and Michael when they stopped being the people your mother and I thought we'd raise, but whoever they are now, they're not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to the people who actually care about me as a person, not as an inheritance." That evening, as I was getting ready to head back to my apartment, Dad handed me a small wrapped package. "What's this?" "Something your mother wanted you to have. She made me promise to give it to you when you proved you were ready to really take care of this family." Inside was Mom's wedding ring, the simple gold band she'd worn for 42 years. Tucked inside the box was a note in her handwriting. "For Sarah, who understands that love is what you do, not what you say. Take care of your father the way he took care of me. Protect what matters, let go of what doesn't." Standing in the doorway of the house where I'd grown up, holding the physical symbol of the marriage that had created our family, I finally understood what this whole battle had really been about. It wasn't about money or houses or legal competence. It was about whether the values Mom and Dad had tried to teach us had actually taken root. Jennifer and Michael had learned to see family as a resource to be exploited. I had learned to see it as something to be protected. Yesterday in that courthouse, those different understandings had finally collided, and only one of them could survive. As I drove back to my apartment that night, Mom's ring safely in my jewelry box, and Dad's legal protection finally secured, I realized I felt lighter than I had in months. The burden of trying to preserve relationships that had already been destroyed was finally gone. The exhausting work of hoping Jennifer and Michael would remember how to be decent human beings was over. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I was looking forward instead of back, and what I saw ahead was a future where Dad could live with dignity, where his independence was protected, and where the people who truly cared about him could focus on making his remaining years as good as possible. The first time I should have seen what Jennifer and Michael really were was at Mom's funeral. I keep thinking about that day, about the moment during the reception when I overheard Jennifer on the phone in the church parking lot, already calling real estate agents to get estimates on Dad's house. Mom had been buried for exactly 2 hours. When I confronted her about it, she said she was just being practical, that Dad would probably want to downsize anyway, and it was smart to know what the market looked like. She said it with that patronizing tone she'd perfected in high school, like I was naive for being bothered by the timing. But now, sitting in my apartment 3 days after the courthouse victory, I'm seeing that conversation differently. It wasn't grief making her practical, it was opportunity making her predatory. I've been going through Mom's things,
boxes of letters and photos that Dad asked me to organize because he wasn't ready to face them yet.
Tucked between sympathy cards and thank you notes from the funeral, I found something that made my blood run cold. A handwritten list in Jennifer's unmistakable loopy script, dated just 2 weeks after Mom's burial. The list was titled, Dad's Assets, and it was detailed in a way that made me sick to my stomach. Not just the house value and retirement accounts, but specifics I didn't even know Jennifer was aware of. Mom's jewelry, appraised and itemized, Dad's life insurance policy, which he'd never discussed with any of us. Even his old tool collection from the garage, with estimated values written in the margins. At the bottom of the page, in Michael's handwriting, were the words split 3 ways after facility costs, with Jennifer's response written underneath. Sarah won't fight it if we frame it right. We had been planning this for 3 years. Since the day we buried our mother, I called Dad immediately, even though it was past 9 at night. He answered on the first ring. Alert and oriented despite what Jennifer and Michael had tried to convince a judge about his evening confusion. Dad, I found something in Mom's papers. Something you need to see. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in my living room, holding Jennifer's asset list with shaking hands. Not the tremor of dementia, but the shaking of betrayal and fury. They went through our financial papers, he said quietly. While we were planning the funeral, they were in my house going through my desk. The violations just kept stacking up. I remembered now how eager Jennifer had been to help with funeral arrangements, how she'd insisted on staying at the house that week to be close to family, how Michael had offered to organize Dad's home office, said he wanted to help get the paperwork sorted out so Dad wouldn't have to deal with it while grieving. They hadn't been helping. They'd been conducting surveillance. Dad, I showed him Michael's phone number written at the bottom of the page, with a note that said Dr. Webb, recommended by Tom Fisher at Riverside. Tom Fisher was the administrator at Riverside Memory Care, the expensive facility they'd been pushing. The same Dr. Webb, who had spent 45 minutes with Dad and concluded he needed immediate placement, was recommended by the facility that stood to profit from housing him. They had the whole thing planned, Dad said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that scared me. The doctor, the facility, the timeline, they were just waiting for the right moment to make their move. I sat down next to him on my couch, looking at the evidence of a conspiracy that had been months in the making. When do you think they decided to move forward? Dad was quiet for a long time, studying the list like it contained clues to a puzzle he'd been trying to solve. Remember when Jennifer started visiting more frequently this spring? When she said she was worried about me driving. I remember Jennifer had started showing up unannounced, always with some concern about Dad's safety or well-being. She'd suggested he stop driving at night. She'd worried about him managing his medications. She'd even bought him a medical alert bracelet that he'd never asked for. She was building a case, I realized, documenting things she could use later to prove you were declining. And Michael started calling more often, asking about my finances. Said he wanted to help me organize my investments, make sure everything was set up properly for retirement. I thought he was finally growing up, taking an interest in being responsible. The pattern was becoming clear now, and it was so much worse than I'd originally understood. This wasn't a panicked response to Dad's diagnosis or a misguided attempt to help. This was a calculated long-term strategy to separate him from his assets, while making it look like loving concern. Dad, do you remember when Jennifer suggested you get a second opinion about your dementia? When she said Dr. Rodriguez might be missing things. That's when she arranged for me to see Dr. Webb, said she'd done research and found someone who specialized in early-stage dementia. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. She drove me to that appointment herself, sat in the waiting room the whole time. I felt sick thinking about it. Jennifer had taken Dad to see a doctor she'd specifically chosen because she knew he would support her agenda. She'd probably briefed Dr. Webb ahead of time about what conclusions she needed him to reach. The man had spent less than an hour with Dad, but somehow felt confident recommending immediate memory care placement. What did you tell Dr. Webb during that appointment? Dad closed his eyes trying to remember. He asked a lot of questions about my daily routine, about whether I ever got confused or lost. I was honest about the diagnosis, about the moments when my memory isn't clear. But I also told him about all the things I still do independently, about how well I'm managing with your help and Grace's support. And he didn't seem interested in any of that. He kept asking about incidents where I'd made mistakes or forgotten things. When I told him about the time I put salt in my coffee instead of sugar, he wrote it down like it was significant. When I mentioned that I'd gotten turned around driving to the new grocery store, he acted like it was evidence of major impairment. Webb had cherry-picked Dad's moments of confusion while ignoring all evidence of his continued competence. He'd taken normal age-related mistakes and reframed them as signs of severe cognitive decline. And he'd done it because Jennifer had specifically sought out a doctor who would support her predetermined conclusion. The manipulation went even deeper than I'd realized. I found more evidence in Mom's papers over the next few days. Credit card statements showing that Jennifer had been researching memory care facilities for months before Dad's appointment with Dr. Webb. Printed emails between Jennifer and Michael discussing timing and presentation and how to make sure their concerns looked legitimate to outside observers. Most damning of all was a draft letter Jennifer had written but never sent, addressed to Adult Protective Services. In it, she expressed concern about Dad's ability to live safely alone and suggested that his youngest daughter might not be providing adequate oversight. The letter was dated 6 weeks before they filed the competency petition. Jennifer had been preparing to destroy my reputation as Dad's caregiver if their first strategy didn't work. If the court hadn't granted guardianship, she was ready to accuse me of neglect and have the state investigate our family situation. Reading that letter, I finally understood the full scope of what we'd been up against. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, about Jennifer's fundamental belief that she knew better than Dad what was good for him. She was willing to destroy his independence, my reputation, and our entire family to get her way. But there was something else in Mom's papers that changed my understanding of this situation completely. A sealed envelope with my name on it, hidden inside Mom's recipe box where she knew I'd eventually find it. The letter inside was dated 3 months before Mom died, written in her careful script despite the cancer medications that made her hands shake. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then the worst has probably happened. Jennifer and Michael have tried to take your father's independence away from him. I've been watching them change over the past few years, watching them see us as burdens instead of people they love. I've tried to talk to them, tried to remind them what family really means, but I don't think they're listening anymore. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing conversations Mom had overheard between Jennifer and Michael, observations about their increasing focus on money and inheritance, and her growing fear that they would try to manipulate Dad after her death. Your father is stronger than they think, but he's going to need someone to fight for him, someone who understands that dignity matters more than safety, that independence is worth some risk. I know that person is you, Sarah. I've watched you take care of people your whole life without expecting anything in return. I've seen you put family before personal gain over and over again. The final paragraph made me cry so hard I had to put the letter down for several minutes. Don't let them convince you that love means control. Don't let them make you feel guilty for protecting your father's right to make his own choices. They'll say they're doing this out of concern, but you'll know better. They're doing it because they've forgotten that some things matter more than money. Take care of him the way he took care of me. Fight for him the way he would fight for you. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone be destroyed by their own family. Mom had seen all of this coming. She had understood Jennifer and Michael's motivations better than I had. She had prepared me for this battle even while fighting her own. When I called Dad to read him Mom's letter, he was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "She always was smarter than the rest of us about people." I kept hoping she was wrong about Jennifer and Michael, but I guess mothers know their children better than fathers do. What do you want to do with all this information? I want to give it to Margaret. I want it all documented and filed with the court. If they try this again, I want there to be no question about how long they've been planning it and what their real motivations are. The next morning, I drove to Dad's house with a box full of evidence that told the complete story of Jennifer and Michael's conspiracy, asset lists, facility research, doctor recommendations, draft letters to authority. 3 years of methodical planning to strip their father of his independence and dignity. Dad was waiting for me in the kitchen with coffee and a grim expression. "I've been thinking all night about what your mother's letter said, about how they've forgotten that some things matter more than money. And I think the problem is that they never really learned it in the first place. Your mother and I, we thought we were teaching them about family loyalty and taking care of each other. But what they learned was that family is a resource you can exploit when you need something." Dad poured himself more coffee, his hands steady despite everything we'd discovered. Jennifer learned that if she cried hard enough, she could get what she wanted. Michael learned that if he promised to do better, we'd bail him out of whatever mess he'd made. We thought we were being loving parents, but we were actually teaching them that other people exist to solve their problems. It was a devastating realization, but it explained so much about how we'd gotten to this point. Jennifer and Michael hadn't suddenly become predatory. They'd always seen relationships as transactional. The only difference was that now the stakes were high enough for their true nature to show clearly. "The recording from the courthouse," I said, "when they talked about you not remembering the conversation anyway. That's how they really see you, isn't it? Not as a person with feelings and dignity, but as an obstacle to overcome." Dad nodded slowly. "And that's how they see you too. Not as their sister who's been taking care of me, but as competition for my asset." We spent that afternoon organizing all the evidence for Margaret Chen, creating a timeline that showed the progression from Mom's death to the attempted guardianship. What emerged was a clear picture of systematic predatory behavior disguised as family concern. But more than that, it showed two completely different understandings of what family meant. Jennifer and Michael saw family as a hierarchy, where they had the right to make decisions about other people's lives. Dad and I saw family as a partnership where love meant protecting each other's autonomy and dignity. Those two visions were fundamentally incompatible. There was no compromise possible between them. Either Dad would retain the right to make his own choices about his life, or Jennifer and Michael would take that right away from him for their own benefit. The battle lines were drawn not just around money or legal competency, but around the basic question of whether other people had the right to control your life if they could claim it was for your own good. And as I looked at 3 years' worth of evidence showing how Jennifer and Michael had systematically worked to undermine Dad's independence, I realized that this fight was about much more than just our family. It was about the fundamental human right to dignity, even when you're vulnerable, especially when you're vulnerable. The phone calls started the week after the courthouse hearing, not to Dad's number, which I'd changed immediately, and not to mine, which they'd blocked anyway. They called Dr. Rodriguez's office, claiming to be concerned about Dad's medical care. They called Grace Murphy, the home health aide, suggesting that she wasn't providing adequate supervision. They even called my supervisor at Springfield General Hospital, expressing worry about my emotional state and whether family stress was affecting my work performance. Jennifer and Michael had moved from direct confrontation to a campaign of systematic harassment designed to undermine every support system Dad and I had built. They were trying to isolate us, make us look unstable, and create enough chaos that some authority figure would step in and give them what they hadn't been able to get through the courts. The worst part was how calculated it all was. They weren't calling from their own phones, which would have left a clear trail of harassment. They were using different numbers, probably burner phones, or calling from friends' houses. They were being careful to sound concerned rather than angry, framing their contact as worried family members rather than bitter adversaries. Dr. Rodriguez called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight with professional restraint. "Sarah, I need to tell you about some calls I've been receiving about your father's care." My stomach dropped. "What kind of call?" "Someone identifying herself as your father's daughter has called 3 times this week, questioning his medication management and suggesting that he's being neglected. She's asked for copies of his medical records and demanded to know why I haven't recommended memory care placement." Jennifer was trying to go around me and Dad directly to his doctor, hoping to find some medical professional who would support her position. When that didn't work, she'd probably move on to calling other doctors, therapists, anyone who might have professional contact with Dad. "Dr. Rodriguez, you know that Dad is doing well with his current care plan. You've documented his cognitive stability and his successful independent living. I know that, and I've told the caller that multiple times. But Sarah, she's also made some concerning allegations about your role in his care. She's suggested that you might be financially exploiting him, or preventing him from getting appropriate medical attention. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer was trying to flip the script, making me the villain in a story where she was the concerned daughter fighting to protect her vulnerable father. It was exactly what Mom's letter had warned me about. What did you tell her? I told her that I couldn't discuss patient information with someone who wasn't authorized, and that any concerns about Mr. Mitchell's care should be addressed through proper legal channels. But Sarah, if these calls continue, I may have to file a report with Adult Protective Services. Not because I believe the allegations, but because I'm required to investigate any claims of elder abuse. That was exactly what Jennifer was counting on. She didn't need to prove that I was exploiting Dad. She just needed to create enough doubt and confusion that someone would start an investigation. Even if I was eventually cleared, the process would be traumatic for Dad and disruptive to his care. I called Margaret Chen immediately after hanging up with Dr. Rodriguez. Margaret listened to my explanation with the grim patience of someone who'd seen this pattern before. This is escalation behavior, she said. When people can't get what they want through legal means, they often resort to harassment and reputation damage. The goal is to make your life so difficult that you'll give up fighting. Is there anything we can do to stop it? We can document everything and file harassment complaints if they contact you directly. But third-party harassment is harder to prove and prosecute. They're being smart about staying just inside the boundaries of what's technically legal. Margaret paused, and I could hear her typing notes. However, there is something we can do proactive. We can file a restraining order request that includes provisions about third-party harassment and contact with your father's care providers. It won't stop them completely, but it will create legal consequences if they continue. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Jennifer and Michael escalated their campaign. Grace Murphy called me on Friday morning, upset and confused. Sarah, I had someone come to Mr. Mitchell's house yesterday, claiming to be from Adult Protective Service. They said they were investigating reports of inadequate care and needed to inspect the house. My heart started racing. What did you do? I called the number on their card, and it went to a disconnected voicemail. Then I called APS directly, and they said they had no record of any investigation or home visit. Whoever it was, they weren't from APS. Someone, probably hired by Jennifer and Michael, had impersonated a social worker to try to get access to Dad's house. If they'd succeeded, they could have taken photos or made claims about dangerous living conditions. They could have tried to interview Dad when he was alone, and possibly confused, hoping to get statements they could use against us later. Is Dad okay? Did he talk to these people? He wasn't home when they came. He was at his Thursday coffee meeting with his friends from the plant. But Sarah, they knew his schedule. They knew he'd be gone. Jennifer and Michael were surveilling Dad's house, watching his routines, looking for opportunities to catch him alone or vulnerable. The violation felt overwhelming, the idea that his own children were stalking him like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. I drove to Dad's house immediately, finding him in his workshop in the garage, completely unaware of what had happened while he was having coffee with his retired coworkers. He was organizing his tool collection, something he did when he needed to feel in control of his environment. Dad, we need to talk about security. I explained about the fake APS visit, about the ongoing harassment calls, about Jennifer and Michael's systematic campaign to destabilize his support system. Dad listened with growing anger, his jaw getting tighter with each detail. They hired someone to impersonate a social worker. That's what it looks like. Grace scared them off by asking for identification and calling to verify. But if you'd been here alone, Dad set down the wrench he'd been holding, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. They're trying to terrorize an old man with dementia. They think they can frighten me into submission. Dad, I think we should consider having someone stay here with you, at least until we get the restraining order in place. No, his voice was firm, absolute. I'm not going to let my own children turn me into a prisoner in my own house, but we are going to fight back. Dad walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the garage,
and pulled out a folder I'd never seen before. Inside were detailed notes in his careful handwriting, documenting every strange phone call, every unexpected visitor, every attempt someone had made to contact him about his medical care or living situation. "I've been keeping track," he said. "Every time someone called claiming to be worried about me, every time Jennifer or Michael showed up with a new concern about my safety. I may have dementia, but I'm not stupid." I could see the pattern. The notes went back 6 months, long before the competency hearing. Jennifer and Michael had been probing Dad's defenses for months, testing different approaches, seeing how he responded to various forms of pressure and manipulation. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about all this?" "Because I wanted to I wanted to have evidence before I accused my own children of what I suspected they were doing." He closed the folder and looked at me steadily. "But after yesterday, after they sent strangers to impersonate social workers, I'm sure." We spent that evening going through Dad's notes and cross-referencing them with the evidence I'd found in Mom's papers. What emerged was a timeline showing 18 months of systematic harassment and manipulation that had been building toward the competency hearing like pieces of a deliberately constructed trap. The fake APS visit was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Jennifer and Michael's desperation became increasingly reckless. Grace Murphy called again on Sunday morning, this time because someone had left threatening flyers in Dad's mailbox. Not threats against his physical safety, but warnings about the dangers of elder abuse and the importance of reporting suspected neglect to authorities. The flyers were professionally printed, designed to look like legitimate public service announcements, but the timing was too convenient, appearing just days after someone had impersonated a social worker. Jennifer and Michael were trying to plant seeds of doubt in the neighborhood, hoping that Dad's neighbors would start questioning whether he was safe in his own home. Miss Patterson from next door brought one of the flyers to Dad's house that afternoon, her face creased with concern. "Bob, I found this in my mailbox this morning. Is everything okay with you and Sarah?" Dad took the flyer and read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The document talked about warning signs of financial exploitation, isolation from family members, and sudden changes in an elderly person's legal documents. It was basically a checklist of everything Jennifer and Michael could claim I was doing to Dad. "Miss Patterson," Dad said, his voice carefully controlled, "did everyone on the street get one of these?" "I think so. Mrs. Kim across the street mentioned getting one too." "Bob, is someone bothering you? Because if you need help." Dad smiled at her, the same reassuring smile he'd used with worried neighbors for 30 years. "Sarah and I are dealing with some family difficulties, but I'm perfectly safe and well cared for. If anyone comes around asking questions about my welfare, please feel free to tell them that I'm exactly where I want to be." After Mrs. Patterson left, Dad sat down heavily at his kitchen table and stared at the flyer. "They're trying to turn my own neighbors against people I've lived next to for decades." The violation of that felt almost worse than the courthouse lies. Jennifer and Michael weren't content to attack us directly. They were poisoning Dad's relationships with people who had been his friends and neighbors for most of his adult life. They were trying to make him feel isolated and suspect in his own community. But Dad's notes revealed that the flyer campaign was just the latest escalation in a pattern that had been building for months. Back in June, Jennifer had started calling Dad's longtime friends with subtle questions about his behavior. Had they noticed him getting confused during conversations? Did he seem to be losing track of details? Was he still safe to drive? Tommy Williams, Dad's best friend since their days working together at the GM plant, had actually called Dad to ask about Jennifer's concerns. "Bobby, your daughter called me yesterday asking if I thought you should still be driving. Said she was worried you might be having some kind of cognitive issues. I told her you seemed fine to me, but she kept pushing about whether I'd noticed any changes." Dad had brushed off Tommy's call at the time, assuming Jennifer was just being overly cautious. But now, looking at the pattern, it was clear that she'd been systematically contacting people in Dad's social circle, trying to plant doubts about his competence and safety. Michael had taken a different approach, focusing on Dad's financial relationship. He'd called Dad's bank, claiming to be concerned about potential fraud or exploitation. He'd contacted Dad's insurance agent asking about policy details, and whether Dad seemed confused during their recent meeting. He'd even reached out to the guy who did Dad's taxes, expressing worry about Dad's ability to understand his financial situation. Each contact had been framed as loving concern from a devoted son. Michael had probably sounded completely reasonable, maybe even admirable for being so attentive to his aging father's well-being, but the cumulative effect was to create a network of people who had been primed to see Dad as potentially vulnerable and incompetent. The most insidious part was how they'd used Dad's diagnosis against him. Early-stage dementia was easy to misunderstand, easy to exaggerate. People who didn't spend time with Dad regularly might hear dementia diagnosis and assume he was much more impaired than he actually was. Jennifer and Michael had been counting on that ignorance to build their case. Margaret Chen reviewed Dad's documentation with the grim thoroughness of someone building a legal strategy. "This is textbook predatory behavior," she said. "They've been laying groundwork for months, creating a narrative about your father's incompetence, while simultaneously positioning themselves as concerned family members." We were sitting in Margaret's office on a gray Monday morning, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry insects. Outside the window, I could see people walking to work, going about their normal lives while our family civil war escalated towards something that felt increasingly dangerous. "The fake APS visit crossed a line," Margaret continued. "Impersonating government officials is a federal crime, and the harassment campaign against your father's care providers could constitute elder abuse under Ohio law. Can we prove they're behind all of this?" Margaret spread Dad's notes across her desk like evidence in a murder case. "Not directly. They've been careful to use intermediaries and maintain plausible deniability, but the pattern is clear enough that a judge will recognize what's happening." She picked up one of the threatening flyers and examined it closely. "These are interesting. Professional printing, expensive paper stock. Whoever made these spent real money on them. That suggests this isn't just angry family members acting impulsively. This is organized, planned harassment." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. Margaret was confident we could get protection for Dad and restrictions on Jennifer and Michael's ability to contact his care providers, but she warned me that restraining orders were only as effective as people's willingness to follow them. If they're desperate enough to impersonate social workers, they might be desperate enough to violate a court order. You need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Tuesday night, I stayed at Dad's house again, unwilling to leave him alone while Jennifer and Michael's harassment campaign intensified. We'd installed new locks and a security system, but the real threat wasn't physical. It was the steady psychological pressure of being under constant surveillance by your own family. Dad was sitting at his kitchen table working on a crossword puzzle, something he did every evening to keep his mind sharp. The routine was important to him, a daily proof to himself that his cognitive abilities were still intact, but I could see the strain around his eyes, the way his shoulders stayed tense even during quiet moments. "Sarah," he said without looking up from his puzzle, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." My stomach tightened. "What is it, Dad? Do you think I'm making the right choice, fighting them like this? Would it be easier for everyone if I just went along with what they want?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. After everything we'd discovered about Jennifer and Michael's manipulation, after all the evidence of their calculated harassment, Dad was still questioning whether he had the right to protect his own independence. "Dad, look at me." He set down his pencil and met my eyes, and I could see how much this battle was costing him. Not just the stress and exhaustion, but the fundamental sadness of realizing that his own children saw him as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to love. "You are not making this difficult by refusing to be exploited. You are not causing problems by insisting on your right to make your own decisions."
Jennifer and Michael created this situation when they decided your dignity was less important than their inheritance. Dad nodded slowly, but I could see he wasn't completely convinced. "I just keep thinking about how much simpler everything would be if I just signed over the power of attorney and let them handle things." "Simpler for who?" "For them, because they'd get immediate access to your money. Dad, you've seen what they're willing to do to get control of your assets." You've seen them lie to judges, harass your doctors, impersonate government officials. Do you really think people capable of that level of manipulation would use power of attorney in your best interests? Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at his crossword puzzle like it contained answers to questions much more important than 7 letters for breakfast bread. Finally, he spoke. Your mother used to say that the hardest part of being a parent was knowing when to stop protecting your children from the consequences of their choices. She said the most loving thing you could do sometimes was let people face the results of their actions. He looked up at me with eyes that held 40 years of parenting wisdom and 3 years of grief. I think maybe it's time I stopped protecting Jennifer and Michael from what they've chosen to become. Wednesday morning dawned cold and gray, matching my mood as we prepared for the restraining order hearing. Dad dressed carefully in his best suit, the same navy blue one he'd worn to Mom's funeral and my college graduation. He wanted to look competent and dignified, wanted the judge to see him as the sharp, capable man he still was, rather than the confused invalid his children had tried to portray. Margaret met us at the courthouse with a briefcase full of evidence and a strategy designed to show the systematic nature of Jennifer and Michael's harassment. She'd organized Dad's notes chronologically, creating a timeline that demonstrated the escalation from subtle manipulation to outright intimidation. Jennifer and Michael arrived with Patrick, all 3 of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. This wasn't the fight they'd wanted. They'd expected Dad to fold under pressure, to accept their authority rather than drag the family through another public legal battle. Judge Morrison, the same woman who'd dismissed their competency petition, took the bench with an expression that suggested she remembered our family and wasn't pleased to see us back in her courtroom so soon. Miss Chen, she said, you're requesting a protective order for Mr. Mitchell. Please explain the basis for this request. Margaret stood and began laying out the case with methodical precision. The timeline of harassment calls to medical provider, the fake APS visit with documentation from Grace Murphy and the real Adult Protective Services office confirming they'd never sent anyone to Dad's house. The threatening flyers distributed throughout Dad's neighborhood. Your Honor, this is a clear pattern of escalating harassment, designed to intimidate an elderly man into surrendering his independence. The respondents have shown they're willing to impersonate government officials and spread false information in their community to pressure Mr. Mitchell into compliance. Patrick tried to object, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and that his clients were simply concerned family members trying to ensure their father's welfare. But Judge Morrison cut him off. Ms. Coleman, I've already heard your client's version of their concern for Mr. Mitchell's welfare. Last week, I found it unconvincing. This week, I find it completely contradicted by their behavior since my ruling. She turned to address Jennifer and Michael direct. You attempted to have your father declared incompetent based on testimony that this court found to be deliberately misleading. When that failed, you launched a campaign of harassment against his care providers and community members. You sent someone to impersonate a social worker, which is a serious crime. Jennifer started to speak, but Judge Morrison held up her hand for silence. I'm granting the protective order. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell, you are prohibited from contacting your father directly or indirectly. You may not contact his medical providers, his neighbors, or any other person involved in his care. You may not come within 500 feet of his residence or workplace. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. The gavel came down with a sound like breaking glass. Jennifer was crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of frustrated rage, the tantrum of someone who'd been denied something they felt entitled to take. As we left the courthouse, Margaret walked us to our car with a satisfied expression. That should give you some breathing room. But Sarah, stay vigilant. Desperate people do desperate things. And they've invested too much in this scheme to walk away easily. She was right. The restraining order didn't end Jennifer and Michael's campaign. It just forced them to get more creative. 2 days later, I got a call at work from my supervisor, Karen Williams. Her voice was carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on alert. Sarah, I need to speak with you in my office. We've received some concerning information about your family situation, and I need to understand what's going on. My heart sank as I walked to Karen's office. Whatever Jennifer and Michael had done now, They'd managed to bring it into my workplace, threatening the job I needed to support both myself and Dad's care. Karen closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit down. On her desk was a manila envelope with my name typed on the front, the same block letters I'd seen on the threatening flyers. "Someone left this for you at the front desk this morning. No name, no return address." Given the restraining order situation you mentioned, I thought it was best to handle this carefully. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message that made my blood run cold. "Your father's neighbors are asking questions about his safety. His friends are worried about changes in his behavior. His doctors are concerned about his care. How long before someone makes an official report? How long before an investigation finds what everyone already suspects? Some problems don't go away just because you get a restraining order. Some problems get worse when you fight too hard to hide them." There was no signature, no direct threat, nothing that could be traced back to Jennifer and Michael specifically, but the message was clear. They weren't done with us, they were just getting started. Karen read the letter with growing concern. "Sarah, I don't know what's going on with your family, but this feels like intimidation. Have you contacted the police? It's complicated," I said, which was the understatement of the century. "My siblings are trying to have my father declared incompetent so they can access his inheritance. When that failed, they started this harassment campaign." Karen leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "Is that why someone called here asking about your emotional stability and work performance?" The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Someone called about me, last week. A woman claiming to be your sister, expressing concern about family stress affecting your job performance. She suggested that caregiving responsibilities might be overwhelming you and asked if we'd noticed any problems with your work quality. Jennifer had tried to sabotage my job. Not content with attacking Dad's support system, she'd targeted my income and professional reputation. If she could get me fired or force me to take leave for stress, it would eliminate my ability to help Dad maintain his independence. Karen, I need you to know that my work performance hasn't been affected by my family situation. I've been handling caregiving responsibilities for 3 years without any impact on my professional duties. I know that, Sarah. Your work has been consistently excellent, which is why the call struck me as odd. But I wanted you to be aware that someone is actively trying to undermine your professional reputation." The letter campaign expanded over the next week. Identical envelopes appeared at Grace Murphy's agency, at Doc Rodriguez's office, and at the offices of 3 other doctors Dad had seen for routine care over the past year. Each contained slightly different messages, but all suggested that Dad was being neglected or exploited, and that an investigation would reveal serious problems. Margaret Chen called it a whisper campaign, designed to create enough doubt and concern that someone would feel obligated to contact Adult Protective Services or other authorities. Jennifer and Michael couldn't directly file false reports without violating the restraining order, but they could try to manipulate others into making those reports for them. "The strategy is psychological warfare," Margaret explained during an emergency meeting in her office. "They're trying to wear you down, make you feel like you're under constant threat of investigation or legal action. The goal is to make fighting them feel more exhausting than giving in to their demands." The worst part was how effective the strategy was becoming. I found myself second-guessing every decision about Dad's care, wondering if normal family interactions could be twisted into evidence of neglect or exploitation. When Dad had a bad day, and seemed more confused than usual, I worried that someone might be watching, documenting, preparing to use his momentary disorientation against us. Grace Murphy called me on a Friday afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. "Sarah, I've had 3 different people call my supervisor this week, asking about Mr. Mitchell's care. They all claim to be concerned community members who've heard rumors about his situation." "What kind of rumors?" "That he's being isolated from his family, that his medications aren't being managed properly, that he's lost significant weight and seems depressed." None of it's true, but my supervisor is starting to ask questions about whether we need to increase his care level or bring in additional oversight. Jennifer and Michael were systematically contaminating every relationship and support system Dad had built. They were turning his medical care, his community connections and his daily routine into sources of stress and suspicion rather than comfort and stability. But Dad surprised me with his response to the escalating harassment. Instead of becoming more anxious or withdrawn, he seemed to grow more determined with each attack. He started documenting everything himself, keeping a detailed log of suspicious phone calls, unexpected visitors, and unusual incidents in his neighborhood. If they want to play games, he told me one evening as he updated his harassment log, we'll show them what a sharp mind really looks like. I may have dementia, but I'm still smarter than they are. Dad had decided that the best defense against Jennifer and Michael's claims of incompetence was to demonstrate his mental acuity through meticulous record keep. Every entry in his log was dated, timed, and cross-referenced with other evidence. He'd turned their harassment campaign into an opportunity to prove exactly how competent and aware he still was. The turning point came 3 weeks after the restraining order hearing. Dad called me at work on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice excited in a way I hadn't heard since before Mom got sick. "Sarah, you need to come over here right away. I caught them." "Caught who doing what?" "Jennifer and Michael. They're watching the house right now from a car parked 2 blocks away. But more importantly, I figured out how they're getting their information about my schedule and activity." When I arrived at Dad's house 20 minutes later, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a satisfied expression and what looked like evidence spread out in front of him. It was the face he used to wear when he'd solved a particularly challenging problem at the plant, the look of someone who'd outmaneuvered an opponent through careful thinking and patience. "Remember how they seemed to know I'd be gone when the fake APS people came? And how they always seemed to call Grace right after she'd been here for visits?" I nodded, sitting down across from him at the table where we'd shared so many important conversations over the past few months. "I've been tracking patterns in their harassment, comparing it to my daily routine, and I figured out that they have someone inside my circle providing information." Dad showed me his harassment log, which had evolved into something that looked like a detective's case file. He'd color-coded different types of incidents and cross-referenced them with his weekly schedule. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Every harassment incident occurred within 24 hours of Dad's regular activities. Doctor appointments were followed by calls questioning his medical care. Visits from Grace were followed by concerns about his home environment. Even his coffee meetings with friends were followed by renewed questions about his social isolation. "Dad, how are they getting this information?" He smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question. "That's what I figured out today." Dad walked to his front window and pointed to a car parked half a block away. "They've been out there for 2 hours watching the house. But they're not just watching, they're coordinating." He handed me a pair of binoculars he'd retrieved from his closet. Through the lenses, I could see Michael sitting in the driver's seat of an unfamiliar sedan, talking on his phone. In the passenger seat was someone I didn't recognize, a woman with short gray hair who was also holding a phone. "That's Amanda Foster," Dad said, "the social worker who did the evaluation for their competency petition. She's been helping them monitor my activities and feeding them information about my routine." The revelation was stunning. Amanda Foster had presented herself as a neutral professional evaluating Dad's living situation, but she'd actually been working with Jennifer and Michael to build their case against him. She'd been using her access as a social worker to gather intelligence that they'd use to coordinate their harassment campaign. "Dad, this is huge. Professional misconduct, conspiracy, maybe even criminal activity." Dad nodded, still smiling. "And I have it all documented. Times, dates, license plate numbers, photographs of them conducting surveillance. 3 weeks of evidence showing they've been violating the restraining order and using a corrupt social worker to gather information." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we were winning rather than just surviving. Jennifer and Michael had gotten sloppy in their desperation, and Dad had outmaneuvered them through patient observation and careful documentation. But as I looked through the binoculars at my brother sitting in that car, coordinating harassment against our father with a corrupt social worker, I realized that whatever hope I'd held for eventual family reconciliation was finally permanently dead. These weren't my siblings anymore. They were adversaries who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and Dad and I were going to have to be smarter,
more determined, and more ruthless than they were if we wanted to protect what mattered most. The war was far from over, but for the first time I believed we could actually win it. The surveillance photos Dad had taken were crystal clear evidence of restraining order violations, but they were also something much more devastating. They were proof that Jennifer and Michael had recruited a network of accomplices to continue their campaign against us. Amanda Foster wasn't acting alone. She was part of an organized effort that included at least 3 other people we could identify from Dad's documentation. Margaret Chen spread the surveillance photos across her conference table like a detective building a murder case. The images showed Michael's car parked in various locations around Dad's neighborhood over a 3-week period, always with different passengers, always positioned to watch the house without being obvious about it. "This isn't just harassment anymore," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years prosecuting elder abuse cases. "This is stalking, conspiracy, and professional misconduct. We have enough evidence here to file criminal charges." Dad sat quietly in the leather chair across from Margaret's desk, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to court hearings, but somehow looking stronger and more determined than he had months ago. The battle with Jennifer and Michael had stripped away any illusions about family loyalty, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and clarity that his dementia diagnosis hadn't touched. "I want to press charges," Dad said, his voice steady and certain, "not just for the restraining order violations, but for everything. The impersonation, the harassment, the professional misconduct, all of it." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Mr. Mitchell, I think that's exactly the right approach. These people have shown they won't be deterred by civil remedies. They need to face criminal consequences for their behavior." The criminal complaint we filed that afternoon was 23 pages long and included charges of stalking, harassment, impersonation of government officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, and professional misconduct. Each charge was supported by meticulous documentation that Dad had compiled over months of careful observation. Amanda Foster was facing the most serious consequence. As a licensed social worker, her participation in Jennifer and Michael's scheme constituted professional misconduct that would likely cost her career, but more than that, her use of her professional credentials to gain access to Dad's personal information crossed into criminal territory. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week, but the real victory came 3 days later when Amanda Foster contacted Margaret Chen, requesting a meeting. She wanted to cooperate with our case in exchange for reduced charges. Margaret and I met with Amanda and her attorney at Margaret's office on a gray Thursday afternoon. Amanda looked nothing like the confident professional who had evaluated Dad's living situation months earlier. She seemed smaller, older, defeated by the realization that her career and reputation were about to be destroyed by her association with Jennifer and Michael. "I need you to understand that I genuinely believed we were helping Mr. Mitchell," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jennifer and Michael presented very convincing evidence that he was being neglected and possibly exploited." Margaret's expression didn't change. "What kind of evidence?" "Financial records showing large withdrawals that Sarah had supposedly made without authorization, medical reports suggesting rapid cognitive decline, photographs of the house that made it look unsafe and unsanitary." My blood ran cold. "What photographs?" Amanda's attorney slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were dozens of images that had clearly been taken inside Dad's house, but they'd been manipulated to make normal household conditions look dangerous and neglectful. One photo showed Dad's kitchen counter covered with pill bottles, making it look like his medications weren't being managed properly, but I recognized the scene. It was from a Sunday when I'd been organizing his weekly pill dispenser, temporarily spreading all his medications across the counter while I sorted them into daily compartments. Another image showed Dad looking confused and disheveled, apparently struggling to operate his television remote, but the timestamp showed it was taken at 2 in the morning, probably during one of his occasional bouts of insomnia when anyone might look disoriented. The most damaging photo showed Dad's bathroom with towels on the floor and what appeared to be medication scattered around the sink, but I could see that the scene had been staged. The towels were placed too deliberately, and the medications were pills I knew Dad didn't take. "Where did Jennifer and Michael get these photographs?" Margaret asked. Amanda looked sick. Jennifer said she'd taken them during family visits when she was concerned about Bob's deteriorating condition. She said Sarah was hiding the extent of his decline, and that these photos showed the reality of his living situation. The photos had been taken during Jennifer's supposed concern visits over the summer, but they'd been carefully staged and manipulated to support a narrative of neglect and incompetence. Jennifer had been building a false case against Dad and me for months, creating fake evidence to justify their attempts at guardianship. There's more, Amanda continued. They had financial records showing that Sarah had power of attorney and was making large withdrawals from Bob's account. They claimed she was stealing his money and isolating him from family to hide the theft. Margaret opened another folder and showed Amanda Dad's actual financial records, which we'd subpoenaed as part of our criminal complaint. Every withdrawal was documented and legitimate. Money for home health care, medical expenses, household maintenance, and groceries. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, nothing that suggested financial exploitation. These financial records Jennifer showed you, Margaret said, holding up photocopied bank statements. They've been altered. Look at the dates and amounts. Amanda studied the documents with growing horror. The bank statements Jennifer had provided showed the same account numbers and basic layout as Dad's real statements, but the withdrawal amounts had been changed and transaction descriptions had been modified to make legitimate expenses look suspicious. They falsified financial records, Amanda whispered. They created fake evidence of elder abuse. The scope of Jennifer and Michael's deception was staggering. They hadn't just lied to judges and harassed care providers. They had created an elaborate false narrative supported by doctored photographs and fraudulent financial documents. They had built their entire case on fabricated evidence. Amanda, Margaret said, we need you to provide testimony about everything Jennifer and Michael told you, every document they showed you, every instruction they gave you about monitoring Mr. Mitchell. In exchange, we'll recommend reduced charges and professional rehabilitation rather than permanent license revocation. Amanda nodded eagerly. I'll cooperate completely. I had no idea they were manipulating evidence. I thought I was helping protect a vulnerable elderly man. The cooperation agreement Amanda signed that afternoon became the foundation for a criminal case that would ultimately send Jennifer and Michael to jail and destroy their reputations permanently. But more importantly for Dad and me, it provided closure to a battle that had consumed our lives for nearly a year. 3 weeks later, Jennifer and Michael pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for reduced sentence. Jennifer received 18 months in county jail and 5 years of probation. Michael got 12 months and 3 years of probation. Both were ordered to pay restitution for Dad's legal expenses and prohibited from any contact with him for the rest of his life. Patrick Coleman faced professional sanctions from the State Bar Association for his role in presenting falsified evidence to the court. Amanda Foster lost her social work license permanently and received 2 years of probation with community service requirement. But the real resolution came on a quiet Sunday morning 6 months after the criminal sentencing. Dad and I were sitting on his front porch drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the same sidewalks where Jennifer, Michael and I had played 30 years earlier. Do you ever regret fighting them instead of just giving them what they wanted? I asked. Dad was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly in the porch swing he'd built with his own hands when I was in high school. You know what I regret? I regret that it took me so long to understand what your mother tried to tell me before she died. What did she tell you? She said some people stop being family when they decide your value is measured by what you can give them instead of who you are. She said the hardest part of love is knowing when to protect yourself from people who used to deserve your protection. Dad stopped rocking and looked at me with eyes that held wisdom earned through the most painful kind of education. I spent 40 years raising Jennifer and Michael to be decent human beings. I thought if I just loved them enough, if I just gave them enough chances, they'd remember what I tried to teach them about treating people with dignity. A cardinal landed on the porch railing and sat there preening its bright red feathers in the morning sunlight. Dad and Mom had always loved cardinals, said they were good luck when they visited your home, but your mother was right. Some people choose to become strangers to their own value. Jennifer and Michael chose money over family, control over love, manipulation over honesty. I didn't make those choices for them, I couldn't change those choices for them, all I could do was refuse to be destroyed by them. The criminal case had been resolved, but the deeper healing was still ongoing. Dad's dementia was progressing slowly but inevitably. Some days were harder than others, some conversations more confused, some routines more difficult to maintain. But he was facing those challenges with dignity and autonomy, in his own home, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his well-being. Grace Murphy still visited twice a week, but now she also brought her teenage grandson who was fascinated by Dad's stories about working at the GM plant. Dr. Rodriguez continued to monitor Dad's condition with visits that felt more like friendly check-ins than medical evaluation. Tommy Williams and the other guys from the plant coffee group had started coming by the house regularly, treating Dad like the sharp, capable friend he still was rather than a patient to be managed. Most importantly, Dad had reclaimed control over his own narrative. Instead of being defined by what he couldn't do anymore, he was defining himself by what he chose to do with the capabilities he still had. He'd started volunteering at the local historical society, sharing stories about Springfield's industrial history with school groups. He'd begun writing down family stories and memories for future generations, creating a legacy that had nothing to do with money or property. The house on Maple Street had become more than just a place Dad refused to leave. It had become a symbol of the right to determine your own life, to make your own choices, to maintain your dignity even when other people decided you were inconvenient or unprofitable. 6 months after the criminal's sentencing, I moved into the house with Dad, not because he couldn't live independently, but because we both realized that family wasn't about obligation or inheritance or even blood relationship. Family was about choosing to take care of each other without expecting anything in return except the satisfaction of protecting what mattered most. On the anniversary of Mom's death, Dad and I planted a new oak tree in the backyard to replace one that had died during a storm the previous winter. As we worked together in the rich Ohio soil, Dad suddenly stopped digging and looked at me with complete clarity. "Sarah, I need to make sure you understand something important." I straightened up, wiping dirt from my hands on my old jeans. "What's that, Dad?" "This whole battle with Jennifer and Michael, everything we went through to protect my independence, it wasn't really about me. It was about proving that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting is hard and expensive and painful." Dad leaned on his shovel, looking out over the backyard where he'd taught 3 children to ride bikes and throw baseballs and plant gardens. "Your mother and I spent 40 years building a life based on the idea that people deserve to be treated with respect and dignity regardless of their age or their health or their usefulness to other people."
He turned to face me directly, his brown eyes sharp and focused despite the disease that was slowly stealing pieces of his memory. "When Jennifer and Michael tried to take that away from me, tried to reduce me to a problem that needed to be solved, or a resource that needed to be managed, they weren't just attacking me. They were attacking everything your mother and I believed about how human beings should treat each other." The new oak tree stood barely 4 feet tall in the hole we'd dug for it, but Dad looked at it like he could see the mighty tree it would become decades in the future. "This tree is going to outlive both of us," he said, "but the principle we fought for, the idea that dignity matters more than convenience, that's going to outlive this tree. That's what we really won when we refused to let them destroy what mattered most." As we finished planting Mom's memorial tree, I realized Dad was right. The battle with Jennifer and Michael had never really been about money or houses or even family relationships. It had been about fundamental questions of human worth and the right to self-determination. We had proven that you could fight predatory behavior, and we had shown that careful documentation and legal strategy could protect vulnerable people from exploitation by their own family members. We had demonstrated that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to be destroyed by people who claimed to love you. But most importantly, we had preserved Dad's right to live and die with dignity, to make his own choices about his care and his future, to remain the author of his own story even as that story entered its final chapter. The criminal justice system had vindicated our position and punished Jennifer and Michael for their attempted exploitation. The legal system had protected Dad's assets and independence through carefully constructed trusts and powers of attorney. The medical system continued to support his autonomy through professional care providers who respected his choices and capabilities. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was Dad sitting on his front porch every morning, greeting his neighbors and watching the world wake up around him. It was the satisfaction of knowing that his home remained his sanctuary rather than becoming his prison. It was the peace of accepting that some family relationships couldn't be saved, but that didn't mean all family relationships were doomed. 2 years after the courthouse hearing where I played that devastating recording, Dad's condition had progressed to the point where he needed more assistance with daily activity. But he was still living in his own home, still making his own decisions about his care, still surrounded by people who saw him as a person rather than a problem. When the time came to increase his care level, it was his choice made in consultation with me and his medical team. When he eventually needed memory care, it was a facility he visited and approved rather than a place he was sent against his will. When he made decisions about end-of-life care, they were his decisions based on his values, rather than choices imposed by people who claimed to know what was best for him. Jennifer and Michael never attempted to contact us again after their release from jail. I heard through distant relatives that Jennifer had moved to Arizona and was working as a cashier at a grocery store. Michael had moved in with his ex-wife and was struggling to find steady employment with a criminal record. Their grand plan to inherit Dad's wealth had cost them their freedom, their reputations, and any possibility of reconciliation with their family. But I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, no sense of revenge or vindication. Their fate was simply the natural consequence of choices they had made about how to treat other people. Dad and I had protected ourselves from their predatory behavior, but we hadn't caused their destruction. They had done that to themselves. The final resolution came on a spring morning when Dad called me into his bedroom and handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful script. "This is my real will," he said. "Not the legal document Margaret has on file, but my personal message to you about what I hope you'll remember about all of this." Inside was a single page in Dad's handwriting, the letters sometimes shaky but the words unmistakably clear. "Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone or close to. But I want you to know that the fight we had with Jennifer and Michael was the most important thing I ever did as your father. Not because I wanted to keep money away from them, but because I wanted to prove to you that your worth isn't determined by what other people think they can take from you. You saved my dignity when you played that recording in court. You protected my independence when you refused to let them manipulate the system. You showed me what real family looks like when you chose to fight for my rights instead of taking the easy path of giving them what they want. But most importantly, you proved that love isn't about control or obligation or even blood relationship. Love is about protecting what matters most in each other, even when that protection requires sacrifice and struggle, and the possibility of losing people you thought would always be part of your life. Take care of yourself the way you took care of me. Fight for your own dignity the way you fought for mine, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let people destroy what makes life worth living. I'm proud of the woman you became and grateful for the daughter you chose to be." Sitting in Dad's bedroom, holding his final message to me, I understood that our victory over Jennifer and Michael had been about much more than legal vindication or financial protection. It had been about proving that dignity and autonomy were worth defending regardless of the cost. We had shown that family wasn't defined by DNA or obligation, but by the choice to protect and support each other without expecting anything in return except the knowledge that you had done what was right. And we had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound act of love was simply refusing to let someone be destroyed by people who claimed to care about them. The house on Maple Street remained Dad's home until the end of his life. The oak tree we planted in Mom's memory grew strong and tall, shading the backyard where 3 generations of our family had played and learned and grown. And the principles we had fought so hard to defend continued to guide my choices long after the legal battles were forgotten, and the family wounds had scarred over into acceptance. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 years after that first courthouse hearing where I'd played the recording that changed everything. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was gentle but professional as she delivered news I'd been expecting but wasn't prepared to hear. Sarah, your father passed peacefully in his sleep early this morning. Grace found him when she arrived for her regular visit. There were no signs of distress or struggle. He simply went to sleep in his own bed and didn't wake up. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Dad and I had planned our legal strategy and documented Jennifer and Michael's harassment campaign. Sunlight was streaming through the windows he'd installed himself 20 years ago, illuminating the coffee cup he'd used just yesterday morning when we'd shared breakfast and talked about his plans to volunteer at the Historical Society later that week. Dad had died exactly the way he'd wanted to, in his own home, in his own bed, with his dignity intact and his independence preserved until the very end. No memory care facility, no court-appointed guardian, no children making decisions about his life based on their financial interests rather than his well-being. The funeral arrangements were everything Dad had specified in the detailed instructions he'd left with Margaret Chen. Simple service at the same church where Mom had been memorialized, burial next to her in Riverside Cemetery under the oak trees they'd chosen together decades earlier. No visitation, no elaborate ceremony, just a gathering of people who had genuinely cared about him as a person. I called Grace Murphy first, then Dr. Rodriguez, then Tommy Williams and the other men from the coffee group who had remained Dad's faithful friends throughout the entire ordeal with Jennifer and Michael. Each conversation was difficult but also strangely comforting, talking to people who remembered Dad as the sharp, dignified man he'd remained rather than the confused invalid his own children had tried to portray. Margaret Chen arrived at the house within an hour of my call, bringing the legal documents that would formalize the end of Dad's life and the beginning of settling his estate. She found me sitting at his kitchen table, holding the coffee cup he'd used that morning and trying to process the reality that our 3-year battle was finally definitively over. "Sarah," Margaret said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but there are some things we need to discuss about your father's final wishes." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope I'd never seen before. My name was written on the front in Dad's handwriting, but underneath was a note that said, "To be opened only after my death in the presence of Margaret Chen." Inside was a letter that would reshape my understanding of everything Dad had been planning during the final months of his life. "My dearest Sarah, if Margaret is reading this letter to you, then I've finally joined your mother and our long fight for dignity and independence is over. I hope you can find some peace in knowing that I died exactly as I chose to live during these last few years, as a free man making my own decisions about my life and my future. There are things I need to tell you that I couldn't share while I was alive. Things about Jennifer and Michael that you deserve to know, but that would have made our legal battles more complicated if they'd become public knowledge. Your mother didn't just suspect that Jennifer and Michael would try to exploit me after her death. She knew they would because they had already started trying while she was still alive. During the last months of her illness, when she was weak and sometimes confused from the cancer medications, Jennifer suggested multiple times that Mom should sign over power of attorney to her. She said it would make managing medical decisions easier, that Mom shouldn't have to worry about paperwork and legal details while she was fighting for her life. Michael pushed for access to our financial accounts, claiming he wanted to help organize our affairs so we wouldn't have to deal with money stress during Mom's treatment. He offered to take over paying bills and managing investments, said it was the least he could do to support us during such a difficult time. Your mother refused both offers, but she told me privately that their timing felt predatory rather than helpful. She said they seemed more interested in gaining control than providing support, more focused on future inheritance than present care. After Mom died, I started paying closer attention to Jennifer and Michael's behavior during family interaction. I noticed how often they steered conversations toward my finances, my living situation, my long-term care plans. I saw how they framed their concerns about my independence as loving worry while simultaneously undermining my confidence in my own decision-making ability. That's when I started keeping the detailed notes you found, documenting not just their harassment campaign but the longer pattern of manipulation that began even before Mom's funeral. I also started recording conversations long before you began carrying that digital recorder to family meetings. Hidden in my workshop, I have hours of audio documentation showing Jennifer and Michael's real motivations and methods, evidence that would have destroyed their credibility completely if we'd needed to use it in court. But Sarah, I want you to understand that our fight was never really about stopping Jennifer and Michael from stealing my money or forcing me into memory care. Those were just the specific tactics they chose to try to control my life. Our fight was about proving that vulnerable people have the right to remain human beings rather than becoming problems to be managed by others. It was about demonstrating that aging and illness don't automatically strip away your right to make choices about your own existence. Most importantly, it was about showing you that love doesn't mean sacrificing your autonomy to make other people feel better about their own fears and limitations. Jennifer and Michael were terrified of watching me decline and die because it forced them to confront their own mortality. They tried to solve that fear by controlling every aspect of my aging process, by reducing me to a set of problems they could manage rather than accepting me as a person they could simply love and support. You chose a different path. You chose to help me maintain my dignity and independence even when that required you to fight your own siblings and risk your own relationships. You chose to see me as a whole person deserving of respect rather than a collection of symptoms requiring management. That choice saved my life in every way that mattered. Not because it extended my time but because it preserved my humanity during the time I had left. Now I need you to make the same choice for yourself. Don't let Jennifer and Michael's failures define your understanding of family. Don't let their betrayal prevent you from trusting other people or building meaningful relationships. Don't let their greed and manipulation teach you that love is always conditional and self-serving. There are people in this world who will care about you the way you cared about me, without expecting anything in return except the satisfaction of protecting what matters most. Find those people. Build a life with them. Create the kind of family that's based on choice and mutual respect rather than obligation and shared DNA. Take the money I'm leaving you and use it to build something beautiful, not just for yourself, but for other people who might find themselves in situations like ours. Help families protect their vulnerable members from exploitation. Support legal reforms that strengthen the rights of elderly people to maintain their independence. Fund resources that help people navigate family conflicts without destroying their dignity in the process. But most importantly, remember that our victory wasn't really about the courthouse hearing or the criminal charges or the legal vindication. Our victory was about proving that some things are worth fighting for even when fighting is difficult and painful and costly. We proved that dignity matters more than convenience. We proved that autonomy is worth some risk. We proved that love means protecting people's right to make their own choices, even when those choices are different from what we think is best for them. I'm proud of the daughter you became and grateful for the woman you chose to be. Take care of yourself with the same fierce determination you used to take care of me. And remember that the best way to honor what we fought for together is to keep fighting for what matters most, even after I'm no longer here to fight beside you. Margaret finished reading Dad's letter in the kitchen where he'd written it, probably late at night when his mind was clearest and his resolve was strong. The morning sunlight had shifted across the table and I could hear the neighborhood kids walking home from school, their voices carrying the same carefree energy that had filled this street when Jennifer, Michael, and I were young. There's more, Margaret said gently. Your father established a foundation in your mother's name 6 months ago, the Robert and Elizabeth Mitchell Foundation for Elder Rights. He funded it with half of his estate and appointed you as the executive director. She handed me a folder containing incorporation documents, mission statements, and strategic plans that Dad had developed with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd used to document Jennifer and Michael's harassment campaign. The foundation was designed to provide legal advocacy for elderly people facing exploitation by family members, financial support for families fighting guardianship abuse, and educational resources about elder rights and dignity. Dad had even secured commitments from Dr. Rodriguez and Margaret Chen to serve on the advisory board. Sarah, your father spent the last year of his life building something that would outlast his personal battle with Jennifer and Michael. He wanted to make sure other families wouldn't have to fight these battles alone. I looked around Dad's kitchen, seeing it now not just as the place where our family had shared meals and conversations, but as the command center where he'd planned a legacy that would help protect other vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation we'd experienced. The funeral service 3 days later was small but powerful. Tommy Williams gave a eulogy that focused on Dad's strength and integrity during his final years rather than dwelling on the family conflicts that had dominated recent headlines. Dr. Rodriguez spoke about Dad's courage in advocating for his own care and the dignity he'd maintained despite his diagnosis. Grace Murphy shared stories about Dad's kindness and humor during their twice-weekly visits. Jennifer and Michael didn't attend. They sent flowers with a generic sympathy card, but they respected the legal boundaries that prohibited them from direct contact with our family. Their absence felt appropriate rather than sad. They had chosen to become strangers to their own father, and his funeral was simply the final confirmation of choices they'd made years earlier. After the service, as people gathered at the house for the reception Mom had always insisted should follow family funerals, I found myself standing in Dad's workshop looking at the hidden recording equipment he'd mentioned in his letter. Sophisticated digital devices concealed inside tool storage, documentation of conversations that went back almost 2 years. Margaret found me there, holding one of the recording devices and trying to imagine Dad planning this elaborate documentation strategy while outwardly maintaining the appearance of a confused old man who couldn't manage his own affairs. He was always 3 steps ahead of them, Margaret said. Even when his memory was inconsistent, even when he had moments of confusion, his strategic thinking remained absolutely sharp. Jennifer and Michael never understood that dementia doesn't affect everyone the same way, or eliminate all cognitive abilities simultaneously. Should I listen to these recordings? Margaret considered the question carefully. That depends on whether you think it would help you understand what happened, or just reopen wounds that are finally healing. Your father won the important battle. The specific details of how he won them might be less important than the fact that he did win them. I decided to leave the recordings undisturbed. Dad's final letter had given me all the understanding I needed about his motivations and method. The additional evidence he'd collected was insurance we'd never needed to use, and I saw no reason to revisit those painful conversations now that justice had been served and closure had been achieved. The estate settlement took 6 months to complete, but the process was straightforward because Dad had planned everything meticulously. The house on Maple Street went to me along with all his personal possessions and half of his financial assets. The other half funded the foundation that would continue his advocacy work long after his personal battle was over. Jennifer and Michael received nothing, exactly as Dad had specified in his will. The document included a detailed explanation of their exclusion that referenced their criminal convictions and their systematic attempts to exploit his vulnerability for financial gain. There was no ambiguity about his intentions and no legal basis for them to challenge his decision. Margaret handled the final legal paperwork with the same professional thoroughness she'd brought to our criminal case against Jennifer and Michael. But the conversation that mattered most happened on a quiet spring afternoon when she came to the house to deliver the last of the estate documents. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about your father that you might not have fully appreciated during all the legal battles." We were sitting on the front porch where Dad had spent so many mornings watching the neighborhood wake up around him. The oak tree he'd planted in Mom's memory was starting to leaf out, creating dappled shade across the yard where 3 generations of our family had played and grown and learned what love really meant. In 30 years of practicing elder law, I've never seen anyone fight for their independence as effectively as your father did. Most people in his situation either give up and accept whatever their families want to impose on them, or they fight so emotionally that they undermine their own credibility. Margaret pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before containing correspondence between Dad and various legal and medical professionals during the months leading up to our courthouse confrontation. Your father approached this battle like a military campaign. He researched the law, consulted multiple experts, developed strategy, gathered evidence, and executed his plan with precision and patience. He never let emotion override logic, never let frustration compromise his effectiveness. The documents showed that Dad had been preparing for Jennifer and Michael's attack long before they actually filed their competency petition. He'd consulted with elder law attorneys in 3 different cities to understand his rights and options.
He'd arranged for independent medical evaluations to document his cognitive abilities. He'd even researched the backgrounds of potential expert witnesses Jennifer and Michael might use against him. Most importantly, Margaret continued, he understood that this wasn't really about him. He knew that if he lost this battle, it would set a precedent that could be used to exploit other elderly people facing similar family pressure. He was fighting for everyone who might face guardianship abuse, not just protecting his own independence. That perspective transformed my understanding of everything we'd been through together. Dad hadn't just been defending his right to live in his own house and make his own medical decisions. He'd been establishing legal precedents and documenting tactics that could help other families facing similar exploitation. The foundation he'd created was the natural extension of that broader mission. Through legal advocacy, financial support, and educational programs, the Robert and Elizabeth Mitchell Foundation would help other vulnerable people protect their dignity and autonomy from family members who saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. 6 months after Dad's death, I had settled into my new role as foundation director and was working from an office in downtown Springfield, helping families navigate guardianship disputes and elder abuse cases. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, connecting me with people who were fighting battles similar to the one Dad and I had won together. The most rewarding cases were the ones where we could provide early intervention, helping families establish protective legal structures before conflicts escalated to the level of courthouse battles and criminal charges. But we also handled crisis situations where elderly people were facing immediate threats to their independence and needed urgent legal advocacy. Each case taught me something new about the complex dynamics of family relationships under stress, about the different ways people responded to aging and vulnerability, about the legal and social systems that were supposed to protect elderly people but sometimes failed them completely. But the case that affected me most deeply came almost a year after Dad's death, when an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen contacted the foundation about her own children's attempts to have her declared incompetent. Dorothy's situation was strikingly similar to Dad. She was a 74-year-old widow with mild cognitive impairment, who was living independently with support from home health services.
Her adult children were concerned about her safety and wanted to move her to assisted living, but Dorothy was determined to remain in her own home. Unlike Jennifer and Michael, Dorothy's children weren't motivated by greed. They genuinely believed that memory care would be safer and better for their mother. But they were making the same fundamental mistake of prioritizing their own peace of mind over their mother's autonomy and dignity. Working with Dorothy and her family taught me that our battle with Jennifer and Michael had prepared me for more than just fighting predatory behavior. It had taught me how to help families find solutions that respected everyone's concerns while preserving the elderly person's right to make their own choices. Dorothy's case ended with a compromise that satisfied everyone involved. She remained in her own home, but agreed to increased home health services and regular family check-ins. Her children got reassurance about her safety, and Dorothy retained her independence and dignity. Most importantly, the family preserved their relationships instead of destroying them through legal battles and bitter conflicts. That successful resolution showed me the difference between our situation with Jennifer and Michael and families facing genuine disagreements about care decisions. Dorothy's children were willing to listen to their mother's concerns, consider her preferences, and work toward solutions that respected her autonomy. Jennifer and Michael had been interested only in imposing their will and accessing their inheritance. The foundation grew rapidly during its first year of operation, handling over 200 cases and helping dozens of families avoid lengthy legal battles through mediation and education. We developed resource guides for families dealing with aging-related conflicts, trained volunteers to provide advocacy support, and worked with legislators to strengthen legal protections for elderly people facing guardianship abuse. But the program I was most proud of was our speaker series, where Dad's story was shared with community groups, professional organizations, and families dealing with similar conflict. Not the details of our legal battles, but the broader lessons about dignity, autonomy, and the difference between protection and control. The message that resonated most strongly with audiences was Dad's insight that love doesn't mean eliminating all risk from someone's life. It means supporting their right to make their own choices about what risks are worth taking, what trade-offs are acceptable, What kind of life is worth living? 2 years after Dad's death, on the anniversary of that first courthouse hearing where I'd played the recording that changed everything, I received an unexpected phone call that brought our story full circle in the most surprising way. The caller identified herself as Amanda Foster, the social worker who had helped Jennifer and Michael coordinate their harassment campaign against Dad. I hadn't heard from her since her cooperation agreement with our criminal case, and I assumed she'd moved on with her life after losing her professional license. "Sarah, I know I have no right to contact you after what I did to your family, but I wanted you to know that I've been following the work of your foundation. I've been seeing the impact you're having on families dealing with elder abuse situations." Amanda's voice was different than I remembered from our legal proceedings. Less defensive, more thoughtful, carrying the weight of someone who had spent 2 years reflecting on the consequences of her choices. "I've been working as a caregiver at a memory care facility since I lost my social work license. It's been humbling work, but it's also been educational. I've learned the difference between genuine care and institutional control, between protecting people and managing." She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "I wanted you to know that your father was right about everything. About the importance of dignity, about the difference between safety and autonomy, about the ways family members can exploit elderly people while claiming to act out of love." Amanda went on to explain that she'd been volunteering with families dealing with guardianship disputes, using her experience with our case to help people recognize warning signs of exploitation and manipulation. She couldn't practice social work anymore, but she could share what she'd learned about the tactics predatory family members use to build false cases against their elderly relatives. "I know I can never undo what I did to your father, but I hope I can prevent other families from going through what you experienced. Your foundation is doing important work, and I wanted you to know that even the people who made mistakes in your case recognize how vital that work is." The call from Amanda reminded me that our battle with Jennifer and Michael had affected more people than just our immediate family. It had educated professionals about the tactics used in elder abuse cases, influenced legal precedents about guardianship standards, and changed how some people thought about the balance between safety and autonomy in elderly care. But most importantly, it had created a legacy that would help other families facing similar challenges long after the specific details of our courthouse battles were forgotten. 3 years after Dad's death, the foundation had helped over 500 families, prevented dozens of unnecessary guardianship proceedings, and supported legislative changes that strengthened protections for elderly people facing exploitation by family members. The house on Maple Street had become the foundation's community education center, where we hosted support groups for families dealing with aging-related conflicts and trained volunteers to provide advocacy services. Dad's workshop had been converted into a resource library, and Mom's garden had been expanded into a memorial space where families could find peace while processing difficult decisions about their elderly relatives' care. But the space that meant the most to me was Dad's kitchen table, where we'd planned our legal strategy and documented Jennifer and Michael's harassment campaign. That table had become my desk, where I reviewed cases and developed programs and wrote articles about elder rights and family dynamics. Sitting there on quiet mornings, drinking coffee from the same cups Dad and I had used during our darkest battles, I could feel the presence of everything we'd fought for and won together. Not just the legal victories or the financial protections, but the deeper triumph of proving that dignity and autonomy were worth defending regardless of the cost. The foundation's work continued to evolve and expand, but its core mission remained exactly what Dad had envisioned in his final letter. We were proving every day that vulnerable people deserve to remain human beings, rather than becoming problems to be managed, that aging and illness didn't automatically strip away the right to make choices about your own existence, and that love meant protecting people's autonomy rather than controlling their lives for their supposed benefit. Jennifer and Michael never contacted me or the foundation, even indirectly. I heard occasionally through distant relatives that they were both struggling with the consequences of their criminal convictions, that their reputations had been permanently damaged by their attempts to exploit their own father. But I felt no satisfaction in their difficulties, no sense that justice required their continued suffering. Their punishment was simply the natural result of choices they'd made about how to treat other people. Dad and I had protected ourselves and won our battles, but we hadn't caused their downfall. They had done that themselves through their own greed and manipulation and willingness to destroy family relationships for money. The final resolution to our story came 5 years after Dad's death, when the foundation received a letter from a family in Oregon whose elderly father was facing guardianship proceedings initiated by his adult children. The letter thanked us for resources that had helped them avoid a destructive legal battle and preserve both their father's independence and their family relationship. Reading that letter in Dad's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of everything we'd built together from the ashes of our own family conflict, I understood that our victory had never really been about beating Jennifer and Michael in court or protecting Dad's money from their exploitation. Our victory had been about proving that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost, that human dignity was more important than family harmony, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to let people be destroyed by those who claimed to care about them. Dad had died exactly as he'd chosen to live during his final years, as a free man making his own decisions about his life and his future. And through the foundation that bore his and Mom's names, that freedom was being extended to hundreds of other elderly people facing similar threats to their autonomy and dignity. The oak tree we'd planted in Mom's memory had grown tall and strong, shading the backyard where future generations would play and learn and discover what it meant to protect what mattered most. And the principles we'd fought so hard to defend continued to guide the foundation's work and my own choices, creating ripples of positive change that would extend far beyond our own family's story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.